Hello, welcome to World Civilizations up to 1500. Now, today we're starting the third topic of the semester, and we're moving forward, so to speak, in the timeline of looking at the ancient world. We already looked at, in the second topic, at one of the very first two river civilizations emerging in the ancient world, Mesopotamia and Egypt, and we looked at their social, political, religious formations, the types of technologies, and so on. You know what they innovated in the world of politics, in the world of the legal systems, and the like. Now, in this third topic, which is titled "The Indo-Europeans and the Hebrews," we're going to look at nomadic peoples in the ancient world. Those were, of course, peoples that lived outside of civilization, that is to say, and how they're going to, in many cases, influence, shape, and transform the initial civilizations that were flourishing in particularly in the Near East, in this case, Mesopotamia and Egypt, how they're going to be transforming radically those civilizations, and we're going to see the rise of new formations in world history. We're going to see the rise, for example, of empires. This is the age when empires are arising very early on in the ancient world, and that was a direct result, again, of the influence of the nomads, the nomadic groups, the Indo-Europeans and the Hebrews, each in their own way. We're going to be exploring here, again, how those groups were influencing, of course, the formation of empires, but also we're going to see the rise of universal ideas as well. With the rise of empires came at the same time the rise of universal ideas, universal institutions that the empires needed in order to govern large numbers of people in a large geographical region. So that required, for the first time in history, innovations, the innovations of more universal ideas that were going to be used in order for people to come together and live under a single imperial order. Let us go to a screen and see here. This is the third topic of the semester. It's titled Indo-Europeans and Hebrews, Nomads and Settlers in the Dawn of Empires and Universal Ideas. So this is the title of the third topic. So as the title suggests, we're going to be paying attention to two main specific groups here that were considered nomadic. You know, those were, of course, peoples that were still living under a culture centered on movement. People were moving from place to place, herding animals, for example. Those were herders. And they lived outside of civilizations, but as we'll see, they're going to interact more directly with the civilizations of the Near East, particularly Mesopotamia and Egypt, and there will be significant transformations of this region that is going to give rise for the first time in world history to empires and some universal ideas, something we're going to cover in depth in this topic. Now, the table of contents show that we're going to approach this topic first by offering a general introduction on the significance of nomadic groups in the ancient world. And they're going to be very, very significant for this course, not only to look at, again, the ancient world and how they're going to affect it and change it, but much, much later in the course, we're also going to see how nomadic groups are also going to affect the classical civilizations that we're going to be looking at the very middle of the semester. We're going to be looking towards the end of the semester at yet another topic that is also going to deal with nomadic groups that are going to be shattering not only the remnants, the remaining institutions of the ancient world, but also they're going to be shattering the institutions that emerged in the classical age of civilizations. The classical age of civilizations spanned from 700 BC, more or less, all the way to 700 AD. Civilizations, for example, that we're going to be looking at, for example, India, China, the Mayas of Mesoamerica, and then in Europe, Greece and Rome, and so on. Those were considered the classical civilizations that flourished much, much later than the river civilizations that we're examining here. Initially, that gave rise to the ancient world. And we're going to see, of course, at the very end of the semester, how we're going to see the rise of the nomads once again, the Vikings, for example, the Mongols of northern Asia, and the Aztecs as well, pouring down into the classical civilizations, and they're going to be, in many cases, altering and shattering those civilizations in very significant ways. So this is the very first instance where we're going to be looking again at nomads having an impact in how civilizations are developing over time. Civilizations are not going to be developing in splendid isolation from the rest of the world, as we'll see, but rather there will be significant interactions with people that lived outside the cities again, and that interaction is going to set the course for how civilizations are going to develop. So we're going to offer a general introduction, first and foremost, to the topic of the nomads, in this case, and their impact on civilizations. And then, once we do that, we're going to approach this topic by examining three major areas. The first, part one, is going to look at the Indo-Europeans. We're going to have an understanding of the origins, for example, of the Indo-Europeans. There's, of course, several hypotheses, again, that have been presented by scholars over the years. The region from which they originated, and at some point looking at their mass migrations from their point of origin. And they're going to be moving around the world and settling in different areas of the globe. This is what we're going to be looking at, particularly in session one, just looking at the Indo-Europeans, their origins, and their mass migrations. In session two, we will be looking at the dawn of empires and universals, and the universal ideas. This is the consequence, again, of the Indo-Europeans moving into different areas of the world, particularly the ones that we're going to be paying attention here that is relevant for this discussion is the Near East. How, as the Indo-Europeans entered the Near East, we're going to see, of course, transformations in Mesopotamia, in Egypt, and we're going to see the rise of empires. We're going to see a series of empires, and of course, some of the universal ideas that they try to implement in order to govern their empires as well. Part three, which is going to be devoted to session three, the last session of this topic, is going to look at the Hebrews. This is another nomadic group that comes out of Mesopotamia, southern Mesopotamia, herders in this case, that were herding animals, herding sheep, moving animals from region to region. Eventually, we're going to look at settlement, how they settled in the area of the Eastern Mediterranean, and they started forming the very first towns, and eventually they're going to actually create a civilization for themselves. We're going to look at the interaction of the Hebrews in that region with the Mesopotamian empires and also the Egyptian empires, and how this is going to shape the course of the Hebrews, this nomadic group that also entered the course of civilization, and how the Hebrews, in their attempt to create a civilization in the middle of conflicting empires, they're also going to give rise to certain universal ideas as well. So this is the table of contents. This is what we're going to cover in this topic. And now let's proceed to look at the general introduction. As I mentioned, it is very, very important to first understand the role of the nomads in world history. In this case, we're really just focusing in the ancient world. But this course is going to have that kind of emphasis again, just looking at how nomadic groups are going to impact the course of civilizations, of world civilizations. All right, so first and foremost, it is very, very important to understand that nomadic groups constituted the vast majority of humanity at this time. When we're looking, for example, at the rise of ancient Sumer, when we look at the rise of, for example, the Egyptian civilization, or we see the rise very early on also of the Indus River Valley civilization in India and so on. Those civilizations that were flourishing, the so-called river civilization that were flourishing very early on in world history, constituted a tiny minority, a small fraction of the entire world population. They were very significant because they were really transforming the course of history, those civilizations. There's no question about that. But the vast majority of the world population are still living outside the cities. In many cases, they're carrying out a nomadic lifestyle or existence. What that means is that the nomads are people that are moving from place to place. They might be inhabiting a particular geographical area, but they're not sedentary. They're not societies that are stationed or settled in one location on a permanent basis. They are moving constantly. Their culture is based on significant movement. They have to move because their culture depends upon the raising and grazing of animals. Sheep, goat, cattle, for example, is very common. Again, one of those most common animals that were actually tended by the nomads in the ancient world. And so they have to be moving their animals so they can find new lands for the animals to feed upon. Again, the pasturage. In other words, the grasslands, if you will. This is what the herders are actually targeting. And as they move into an area and the animals pretty much consume the pasturage, they will have to move into another area as well. Some of those nomadic groups also engage in hunting and gathering as well. So they're, of course, tending animals, but at the same time, they continue this practice of hunting animals. They have to supplement their diet, of course, with both wild game and also some edible plants that they're collecting along the way when they're moving from place to place. So their culture, once again, is based on significant movement. They're moving along certain areas, particularly areas that have not only pasturage but also water resources as well. And they constituted the bulk, if you will, of the world population, even at this time that we're looking at, in the rise of civilizations. Now, with the rise of civilizations, we see, of course, now two different kinds of societies emerging very early on. On one hand, of course, are the nomads, but on the other are the sedentary societies that are emerging in different parts of the world. Those sedentary societies, as I explained very early on in the first topic, were actually the horticulturalists. Those were actually peoples that were beginning to form villages and communities in order to domesticate wild plants and create gardens. That is to say, those are sedentary. Those are actually now settled communities that are experimenting with horticultural practices, creating gardens. They are also stationed along important geographical locations, vital locations where it has good soil, plenty of water, and so on. And they're creating their little communities. They're growing their own food, and of course, they're also engaged in hunting, gathering, fishing, and so on. There's also the civilizations that we looked at in the second topic, Sumeria, for example, and Egypt. Those are also considered sedentary societies per excellence. They're undergoing another kind of revolution. We looked at the agricultural revolution, which gave rise to big cities and the like, large urban areas, something we discussed, previously. So what we see very early on is two different kinds of societies: the nomadic societies that are moving and the sedentary societies. And despite the fact that those were very different societies, there was some interaction that occurred between those two. This is not to say that the nomads were totally independent and apart and isolated from the sedentary societies. There was a certain relationship that existed between those two. And those relationships were very, very varied. In some occasions, those relationships involve, for example, trade. The nomads from time to time will engage in trade with the sedentary societies because they, of course, tended animals, they raised sheep, goat, cattle, and they were willing to trade some of those animals in return for, let's say, crops, some other food products or artwork or tools, etc. And so at times those relationships were quite peaceful, and there was a certain commercial exchange that occurred from time to time between those two. In other occasions, those relationships turned more conflicting, and that often happened whenever the nomads experienced, of course, a decrease in pasturage, which led to a decrease in their animals. And so whenever the nomads experience scarcity of resources, they will often resort to warfare in order to raid the sedentary societies, in order to steal crops, for example, or food, animals, or treasure for that matter. So it varied from time to time. Those relationships often shifted from peaceful commercial transactions and trade to warfare and invasions. So it was a complicated story, of course. This was common in the ancient world. Now, there are two very significant nomadic groups that are going to have a significant influence in the Near East civilizations and other civilizations, but for this topic we're going to be paying attention to the Mesopotamian region and Egypt. And those two groups that were nomadic and that had been nomadic for thousands of years were the Indo-Europeans and the Hebrews. We're going to examine rather closely here both of those groups, looking at their societies, their social structures, their political organization, their religious worldview as well. We're going to be paying attention again to those features and how at some point those two groups are going to expand, and they're going to start moving into different areas of the world. In this case, we're going to be paying attention to the Near East and how they're going to impact the Near East and change it. The civilizations, for example, of ancient Sumer will be changed, and we're going to be looking, of course, at the rise of empires. So this is very, very important, how the course of civilization will be altered as the nomads, particularly the Indo-Europeans, but also the Hebrews, are going to influence those civilizations by their interaction with them. As we'll see, we're going to examine the kind of interactions that led to those transformations and how they're going to change the course of the ancient world. They're going to actually remake it. The ancient world will be totally transformed out of the interactions with the nomadic groups. And we're going to see, as I've been pointing out, of course, new developments, new innovations, such as, for example, something that had never existed in the past, like an empire, for example, a series of empires, along with certain new ideas as well. So you can see how nomadic societies are also going to play a key role in shaping human history. Civilizations are not really developing on their own. They're going to develop along their interactions with the outside world. And the outside world, in many cases, will determine the course of history. Again, so this is what we're going to be looking at, again, in this topic. So now that we have gained some just general understanding of the significance of the nomads in the ancient world, now let's look at one of those groups, the Indo-Europeans. This is, again, part one, and part one is going to concentrate exclusively on the Indo-Europeans, which is going to have a profound effect in the ancient world. And they're going to influence civilizations not only in the Near East, as we'll see later on in the semester, they're also going to influence other civilizations, for example, the Indus Valley civilization. That is the civilization of ancient India as well. We're going to discuss that in a whole separate topic much later in the semester when we look at India and the arrival of the Indo-Europeans to this region and how they're going to actually change it and transform it. So let's look at the Indo-Europeans. And as I mentioned, this is a nomadic group that goes back in time. The earliest records date to 7,500 BC. This is a linguistic group. When we talk about the Indo-Europeans, we're talking about a linguistic group in this case, not a race, because again, something that we covered already in the first topic is that, again, we're looking at Homo sapiens at this point, and Homo sapiens constitute a single, if you will, species, a single species. The variations among Homo sapiens have been due, in other words, the physical differences and characteristics, all those variations have been due according to the influence of the environment, environmental adaptation to different climates and soils and the like around the world. So when we talk about the Indo-Europeans, we're not really talking about a race of people, but rather this is a linguistic group. A linguistic group that, according to linguistics and historians and archaeologists, this group goes back to a region of Europe that borders with Asia. Again, this is a group that, historically speaking, settled and appeared on the world scene, if you will, in a region that actually borders, it is actually the midsection that divides Europe and Asia. Now, the origins of the Indo-Europeans are still widely debated today among scholars. Where they actually came from, very specifically, their ancestral homeland, and so on, if there's any, for example, and so on. So it's still very much debated today. So there's a lot of theories, what I call hypothesis. A hypothesis is really an assumption. There are some material, of course, evidence to support each hypothesis, but still, they're considered general assumptions or vague theories about the origins of the Indo-Europeans. According to scholars that debate the origins of this group, it is estimated that they're beginning to show their presence around 7,500 BC all the way to 5,000 BC. Again, this is kind of like the very early origins of the Indo-Europeans appearing on the world scene. And as I mentioned, this is a linguistic group. So this is how, as I explained very early on in the semester, today scholars are trying to reconstruct history. And one of the ways that they're reconstructing the past whenever there's a lack of resources is to trace, for example, patterns of language and dialects that are connected to one another, so they can go back in time and make connections and find, of course, traces for the development and movement of certain groups of people. When there's a lack of resources, you have to resort to language in this case. The Indo-Europeans are considered a linguistic group that goes back thousands of years into the past. And the earliest records of the language that the Indo-Europeans spoke, that is really the root or mother language of all the Indo-European languages, is called Sanskrit. Now, there are some scholars that propose that Sanskrit might be derived from an earlier language, but that language has been totally lost in time. There's no traces of that today, that survive today, that is to say, as opposed to Sanskrit. Sanskrit, there are still certain regions in the world where people continue to speak Sanskrit. This is not something that, of course, entire communities actually speak. Those are actually reserved for certain scholars or priests, particularly in the Far East, in places like India, for example, northern India. Sanskrit. So this is, again, a language that was spoken thousands of years ago, that is considered perhaps one of the oldest languages in the world, as a matter of fact, one of the oldest languages in the world. And this is the root language of all the Indo-European languages. For example, the vast majority of the language spoken in Europe, for example, comes from Sanskrit. This is also, the root language of the languages that are spoken in places like India, in places like in the Middle East as well, in certain regions of the Middle East, like modern-day Iran and so on. And of course, the European languages today are all over the world. They're not only spoken in Europe, of course, English, Spanish, Portuguese, and some other languages are spoken around the world at this time. And they're all derivatives of Sanskrit, okay? So this is something that I'll be explaining in a few moments once we look at the migrations again. So you can see how the Indo-Europeans are emerging very early on, and their root language, Sanskrit, as they spread around the world, was broken up into a series of different variations, different dialects, if you will, or languages that are derived directly from Sanskrit. So this is a linguistic group. First and foremost, this is something that has to be understood since the very outset, since the very beginning of this discussion. Okay, so the region that most scholars agree that the Indo-Europeans came from is this region we see right here. Again, this is a region today of southern Russia, for example, Eastern Europe and southern Russia. The Caucasus Mountains, for example, is part of that region, this larger area. And this is one of the most widely accepted theories about the origins of the Indo-Europeans, that they're emerging from this region, and out of this region they're going to be spreading around different areas of Europe, as we'll see, and the Middle East and Asia. Now, there are other scholars, there's some Scandinavian scholars, particularly from Denmark, that propose that perhaps the Indo-Europeans came from another area. So prior to having migrated from this region, from the Caucasus Mountains, for example, southern Russia, that prior to this time, and we're pushing the date much, much farther back in time, that the Indo-Europeans emerged from a region of the Middle East in which today is present-day Afghanistan, for example. And their theory is based on certain archaeological findings, particularly religious paraphernalia that they have found in modern-day Afghanistan that is very similar, if not identical, to the religious symbols of the Indo-Europeans that lived in this region much, much later. So there's archaeological findings that really are older than the Indo-Europeans that lived here in southern Russia, that goes back thousands of years into the past, and they come from modern-day Afghanistan, that region of the Middle East. So again, that's another theory that is, of course, being proposed as to what is really the origin of the Indo-Europeans. So again, still very much debated as to where they actually came from. But this region that you can see here in this map appears to be a sort of accepted, if you will, idea among scholars today, that this is where the Indo-Europeans actually came from initially. At least this is what the records show. Now, prior to this time, again, we need more evidence to come out in order to reframe, again, this theory. And so theories, of course, are constantly changing over the years as more and more data comes out, of course. Theories are not set in stone, they change, of course, according to new knowledge. So, first and foremost, this is the region, the homeland of the Indo-Europeans. And out of this region, the Indo-Europeans, which were nomadic groups, we're going to look at their social organization, their political organization, and the like. Out of this region, they began to migrate into different parts of the world, particularly Europe. So some of those groups actually went westward, and they populated great portions of the European continent. Others went into the Middle East, and they settled there, while others continue their journey all the way to Asia, and they moved into what is today modern-day Iran. Others went into India, and still some others continue their journey into places like, for example, modern day Siberia, China, including Japan. There some archaeological evidence of the presence, very, very early presence of Indo-Europeans in modern day Siberia, China, and Japan as well, about 5,000 BC or so. So they are, of course, moving gradually. This is a very gradual process. Again, this is not really an overnight process. This takes really centuries, if not millennia, again, to accomplish, those mass movements, those mass migrations. But it's very significant how, as we'll see, as the Indo-Europeans are beginning to move into different areas of the world, they're going to be, of course, exerting a certain impact and influence on the societies that they encounter, whether those societies were nomadic or sedentary, early village life, or flourishing, for example, or emerging societies, civilizations, for example. Now, let's look at their nomadic background. As I mentioned, nomads are people that are moving from place to place, herding certain animals, for example. They're herders, animal herders. This is their livelihood. This is how they sustain their group. But now let's look more in depth about, in very general terms, what kind of livelihood they created, what kind of society, what kind of political institutions and the like they actually formulated during this time, very early on. So, first and foremost, the Indo-Europeans domesticated cattle very early on in human history. This is one of the very first animals that were, of course, wild animals, cattle, of course. They domesticated cattle, and they used cattle as a way to sustain their societies. They will raise and graze cattle, and of course they will consume the meat, but they also consumed the milk that came from the cow, and of course they started experimenting with the milk and creating things like cheese, for example. So they were the very first human groups in the world that, on one hand, domesticated cattle, but at the same time they started consuming milk and cheese. So very early on, they developed a certain tolerance for lactose. So this group is very tolerant to lactose, as opposed to other groups that did not go through this process. So therefore, because they were never exposed to the proteins and the enzymes, for example, of the milk, whenever they consume milk, they develop what is called lactose intolerance. The Indo-Europeans are characterized for being very, very tolerant to lactose. Okay, so their mode of subsistence is called pastoralism. Pastoralism. They're pastoralists. This is very different from the hunters and gatherers of the Paleolithic age that we discussed in the first topic. In the Paleolithic age, including still in the Neolithic age of the New Stone Age, there were still people engaged in something called hunting and gathering. All they will do in order to survive is go out into the woods, into the fields, and hunt wild game and, collect edible plants. Here, the pastoralists, although they're still doing that, they're entering a new kind of phase in the way that they're producing food. So instead of just going out to hunt the animals, what they're doing is that they're trapping certain animals and they're now bringing those animals so they can actually raise them and graze them. And so the animals are beginning to become more and more at ease and connected to the humans, in other words. So there's a certain relationship between the humans and, of course, those animal species. They're being domesticated, in other words. The animals are being domesticated, and it is easier to handle them. They're no longer considered wild. Of course, there's a process of change and adaptation for those animals, of course, to take place. As they're being domesticated, it will take time for those animals to feel, of course, at ease with humans. And so now, instead of just relying on hunting, now you can just graze the animals, that is to say, and move the animals around. You have to handle the animals and so on. So this is what is called pastoralism, in other words. Okay, so the Indo-Europeans very early on entered this new phase of development. Okay, and it was a sort of bridge between the hunter and gatherer and the horticulturalist. Those people that are beginning to farm, in other words. So the jump from hunting and gathering to horticulturalism, you can say that the middle stage that connects those two different modes of subsistence is called pastoralism. Now, the Indo-Europeans were also characterized for their activities in warfare, because in many cases there was intense competition between different groups that were, of course, pastoralists as well. They were competing for territories in order to graze animals, and that produced, of course, rivalries and conflicts over who has entitlements over certain regions, that has water and grasslands and so on. And that, of course, creates the need for develop a certain culture of war. So very, very early on, and this is very, very significant, that this culture of war is emerging very, very early on among the Indo-Europeans. And of course, they're not really the only ones that are undergoing this change. There will be other nomadic groups we're going to be exploring, of course, much, much later, that also develop a culture of war in order to secure resources for their animals, other pastoralists, in other words, like, for example, the Mongols of Northern Asia. So this is by no means just the Indo-Europeans, undergoing those changes, but rather, again, there are other pastoralists that are also moving in this direction as well. So this can be seen as a pattern of the pastoralists that they must develop a certain skill in warfare in order to defend their territory, to sustain their way of life. This is true for the Indo-Europeans. This is also true for the Mongols, and also true for the Semitic groups of the Middle East, particularly in the Arabian Peninsula. We're going to be looking at that, of course, much later as well. So, as a result of developing their culture of warfare, they were pressed to develop certain technologies as well, war technologies. One of the most important of those war technologies developed very early on by the Indo-Europeans was using the horse. They are also going to domesticate the horse and use the horse particularly and primarily for war-related purposes and activities. And this is going to give them a great advantage over all the other groups that did not have the horse, of course. So the horse in the ancient world was considered perhaps the greatest asset for any group around the world, because that gave them a great advantage in warfare. Again, it is easier, of course, to wage war if you are riding a horse than if you are, of course, on foot. Of course, it's very obvious. With the horse, they started innovating, of course, other technologies that will go along with the horse, like, for example, war chariots. Okay, the chariot, of course, is again a certain manageable carriage that you tie to a horse, and of course you will have to develop another technology, the wheel. So the Indo-Europeans were known for having innovated what is called the spoked wheel as well, to perfect the movement of warriors across the landscape and be able to raid upon other groups and, of course, carry out warfare more effectively and more efficiently. So they were the innovators, again, of the very first technologies. The horse is considered at this time a war technology, and it will be considered for thousands of years to come, until, of course, the coming of modern technology, like modern tanks, for example, and automobiles and jeeps and so on, that really replaced the horse. But they were the innovators of those technologies very early on, and of course bronze tools as well. Bronze was also a metal that the Indo-Europeans developed. They discovered bronze, and they began to forge bronze tools, in many cases also for war-related activities as well. Weapons of different kinds and so on, spears and so on, that they used in warfare. So what is very, very important to note is that very early on, the Indo-Europeans are not only engaged in a nomadic existence, in a culture based on movement, but at the same time, it is a culture that is beginning to take shape in terms of a culture based on warfare as well. And they're developing certain technologies. They're using those technologies and perfecting those technologies along the way, and this is going to give them a great advantage over other societies. Now, in terms of their social structure, it is very, very important to understand how those societies were organized, how the Indo-Europeans were organized. At the base of their society, the way they organized is that those societies were tribal societies first and foremost. In other words, the Indo-Europeans, although they're considered a linguistic group that goes back in time to a group that actually shared a common language, Sanskrit, nonetheless, we're not really describing here a single unified group that was organized as a single society, but rather it was a group that was broken up into a series of different tribal groups. What is really a tribal group? Okay, so at the very core of what is called a tribe is what is called kinship. Okay, kinship. Let me just write it here. Kinship. Kinship, what that indicates is that at the core of the society is the concept of the extended family. That's what a tribe is. It's an extended family group in which the members of the group share familial links and connections to one another, either because they were born into the group or because people marry into a specific group, so therefore you become part of the family, or you were adopted as well. So adoption was also common. You join a group, a certain tribe, and over time, you become part of the family, in other words. Okay, so it's kinship. So those were actually tribal societies. This is at the core of their social structure. And there was a multiplicity of different tribal groups among the Indo-Europeans that at some point in the distant past, they shared, of course, a common language, but as we'll see, they started breaking apart, and that language started really breaking apart into a series of other languages as well. Now, they're also known, the Indo-Europeans, to have followed what is called a patrilineal organization as well. What is patrilineal? Well, it is that the male was dominant in society, and the father was at the very head of the society in terms of being the head of each one of the families, but also the head of the entire tribal group. They had a tribal chief, and that tribal chief was male. The head of the family was also male, and people kept records of the history, the line of the father going back in time in many generations. That is what's patrilineal, and that is to say that the line of the father was actually kept by people, on one hand, passing the leadership positions to the male heir, for example. So it is really the male heir that continues the leadership of the family and so on. But on the other, what patrilineal also means is that people keep the last name, in this case, of the father. The line of the father is kept by maintaining the last name of the father as well. That is what patrilineal means. Now, I mentioned that those tribal societies had a male figure at the very top of society. More than a chief, that male figure was actually a king. So every tribal group of the Indo-Europeans had actually a monarch or a king, an elected king. That king was often elected. I will explain in just a few seconds how that process was carried out. But this is very important to note because unlike, for example, Egypt and Mesopotamia, where the kings were supposed to be divine figures, incarnations of the gods and so on, representatives of the gods in heaven and so on, that served for life, and they passed on their title to their descendants and so on. Here is very different. We do have the figure of the monarch, but this monarch is elected. So it's a very different kind of monarchy. So this is very important to note because not all monarchs in the ancient world derive their power from the same source, or they are installed in power through the same mechanisms. There's a wide variety of different monarchical systems in the ancient world, and this is yet another type of system, the elected monarchy, as it is called. They're also considered priests. The Indo-European monarch in a tribal group, for example, he was actually the king. He also carried out priestly functions, but it was more important the political functions that he carried out, particularly as a warrior. He was supposed to be the topmost warrior of the group, and his responsibility was to wage war and protect the society, protect the tribal group that he was in charge of. At the same time, he also carried out some priestly functions, but those were secondary. And to compare Egypt and Mesopotamia with the Indo-Europeans, for example, when we looked at Egypt, priestly functions for the pharaoh were primary, were far more important than the administrative functions. The administrative functions were carried out by the other members of the hierarchy, like the Grand Vizier and the other administrators. But here, the political functions are far more important for the Indo-Europeans than the priestly functions, although both are carried out simultaneously. Now, just below the monarch in the tribal group, in this tribal society, stood a council of elders. In many cases, those are the patriarchs, the leader of each family, because a tribal group is composed of a series of families. They're all related to one another. They go back to common ancestors and such. And so the patriarch or the leader, the male leader of each family, came together and formed a council. And they're also a governing body as well. They share power with the king. The tribal chief or king of those societies was not an absolute ruler, as I said. He had no absolute power whatsoever. He had to share power with other bodies as well. And in this case, they're known as the Council of Elders. This is very important because this structure, this political organization, is going to remain pretty much intact for millennia. As the Indo-Europeans are moving into different parts of the world, they're carrying along with them this type of organization. And they're going to be, of course, installing those societies as they went around the world. And the elected monarch, along with the Council of Elders, for example, will be maintained perhaps under different forms and names, but the same structure pretty much is preserved. Below the Council of Elders, there's an assembly of warriors. Okay, warriors are important because this is a warrior society. Okay, remember the culture of warfare that I just explained. So there is an assembly of warriors, and they also have significant power. As a matter of fact, it is the assembly of warriors, along with the Council of Elders, that the kings are elected. How kings are elected? Well, the assembly of warriors are the ones actually electing the king. And that king who is elected from time to time is coming from the assembly of warriors. In other words, the assembly of warriors choose the topmost warrior amongst the assembly to become the monarch for the purpose of waging war and protecting the people. And whenever the king is not fulfilling the functions, if a king fails, for example, to win a battle or a war, that king can be removed and be replaced by another warrior who will carry out those functions more effectively. So it's very, very important how the assembly of warriors are going to also exert significant power among the Indo-Europeans. Below, there's another, of course, group of people, and are, of course, the slaves. The Indo-Europeans also have, along the society, a group of slaves. In many cases, those slaves do not come from their own tribal group, but from other tribes. Whenever there's a war, for example, between different tribes, well, the losing tribe, in many cases, ended up being enslaved by the winning party, and this is how the winning party is able to increase their numbers and, of course, increase the supply of workers and labor. That will be doing the work for them in many cases. Okay, so this is extremely important to note and understand. Now, the religious worldview of the Indo-Europeans is also very, very important to understand, because this is going to enable us to understand their influence on the regions that they're moving into. As they're going to be moving into different parts of the world, they're moving along not only their technologies, their way of life, but also the way they see the world around them, the culture, in other words, the world of ideas, the world of meanings. The Indo-Europeans, of course, have a religious worldview based on animism. They do believe that the world is inhabited by spirits. That's what animism is, that everything in the world is moved by the power of different kinds of spirits. But also, the Indo-Europeans developed over time another worldview called pantheism. And what pantheism is the idea that the world of nature is inhabited by gods, in other words, that the gods, the major gods of creation, do not live in another realm, in a spirit world that is disconnected and removed from nature, that they're here in nature itself. okay, that you can find the gods of creation among people. They are, for example, the sun god. Again, this is one of the most common beliefs in pantheism. It is that the sun is a god, or the moon, for example, is a god or a goddess for that matter. The sky is a god, and so on. Again, so that is what pantheism is God in nature. That is the definition of pantheism: God or gods in nature. Okay, or you can say that nature is just God. That's another way of saying it. In other words, that God and nature are not separated. They're not isolated from one another, but they're totally intertwined. One of the main gods and goddesses of the Indo-Europeans was the sky god and the earth goddess, for example. This is very important. Those are the major gods that they worship. Not the only ones by any means, but they are indeed one of the major gods and goddesses of the Indo-Europeans. And we can see manifestations of those very fundamental beliefs in the regions that the Indo-Europeans actually moved into. They moved into different parts of the world and they created different cultures, but nonetheless, that they're moving into different areas of the world. They're moving along with them their cultural ideas, particularly their religious ideas, like the sky god and earth goddesses. The sky god was sacred to the Indo-Europeans because they're nomadic. The nomads are moving from place to place, and in many cases, they are guided by the sky. The sky becomes like a guide. They're observing, for example, the patterns of the sun, the moon, and they see that the sky is sacred because it's guiding their migrations. So they believe that the sky is sacred. It must be a god, in other words, and is the home of all the other gods, like the stars and the planets, the sun and the moon. They all live in the sky, and they guide us, in other words. So that's why they worship the sky. This is the god of the nomads worldwide. Not only the Indo-Europeans worship the sky, also the Hebrews, the Arabian, of course, peoples in the Arabian Peninsula, the Semitic peoples as they're called, even the Mongols of Northern Asia and so on, the Aztecs of North America and so on. They all worship the sky. They have sky gods. It's very important. And of course, the earth is seen as a goddess because this is, again, nourishing people with plants, with animals, and it's seen, of course, as a mother as well. Now, some of the Indo-European peoples and cultures, as we see the split, of course, of the Indo-Europeans into different groups, were the Greeks. The Indo-Europeans moved into Europe, as we'll see in just a few moments, and they became the ancient Greeks. And we can see that the Greeks continue with those ancestral beliefs when they worship, for example, Gaia. Gaia is Mother Earth. She is the mother of all people, and she's nurturing people with the elements, with air, and so on, sustaining life, for example. They also believed in the underworld called Hades, an afterlife where people go after death, and this is not really a nice place. They also considered the Hades as a sort of place where people just, spend their existence in total isolation from other human beings, and they're totally unhappy. The Greeks believe in nature deities. Remember, animism. They believe that there are spirits in nature that animate everything in creation, for example. One of their main sky gods, that's also a thunder god, was Zeus, for example. Zeus is one of the main gods of the ancient Greeks, and this is, again, really the sky god of the Indo-Europeans very early on. So this is a manifestation or continuity, again, of those beliefs. In India, we see that the Indo-Europeans will be reaching India as well around 2000 BC or thereabouts. This is a tentative date, according to scholars. And they are bringing along with them also those beliefs like Mitra, for example. We see in India, in the religion of India, people worshiping Mitra, which is nothing other than the earth goddess, for example. The Indo-Europeans that arrived to India also worship the sky god, and it becomes Indra in India in Hinduism. We see the emergence of a sky god called Indra. He is not only the sky god, he's also associated with thunder. Thunder is in the sky. And over time, Indra will be considered to be the creator of the world. The sky god becomes the creator of the world, and also the soul of the world. It's called Purusha, or Purusha is actually the soul, the world soul as well. Some Indo-European groups went into Central Europe. They're going to become the Germanic tribes, for example, and also they're going to be moving into Northern Europe. They're going to become the Vikings, the Norse, if you will. And you can see an association, a connection to those ancestral beliefs. For example, the worship of Freya, which is really the earth goddess, for example, Freya, and also Thor, the god of thunder, which was actually the sky god that the Germans and the Scandinavians, the Vikings, in other words, the Norse people actually worship simultaneously. Now, as I explained, the Indo-Europeans are going to be moving out from their place of origin in this region of southern Russia, for example. They're going to be moving into different areas of the world. This movement started, at least the records indicate that they started moving around the year 3000 BC. Okay, 3000 BC, and they continued to be moving in different parts of the world all the way to 1200 BC. So it took thousands of years, again, of moving into different directions. Why is it that the Indo-Europeans are going to be moving into different areas of the world starting around 3000 BC? Well, one of the most accepted theories in academia now is the theory of, it's called environmental change. In other words, that around 3000 BC, there was an environmental change that occurred in this region called Eurasia, the region that unites Europe and Asia, the very bridge, if you will, creating, of course, more droughts. Less rain meant less pasturage to feed the animals. And so the Indo-Europeans began to move out in search for more grasslands and more pasturage, perhaps looking for other resources, as I mentioned. The nomads have that characteristic that whenever the conditions change and they experience scarcity of resources, they become more active, they're moving, and they're moving away from their place of origin because it's unproductive, and now they're moving, of course, areas that will provide sustenance for their animals and for their societies. So this is one of the most accepted theories in academia, environmental change. And they moved into three regions of the world. One was Europe. They're going to be moving into Europe properly, again, proper Europe, in other words. Two, Asia Minor, the region that today is considered the country of Turkey, for example. In the ancient world, this region was called Anatolia. Okay, and the third region will be Asia, moving into places like, for example, Persia, modern-day Iran. They're going to be moving still eastward into present-day India, in the Indian subcontinent, and yet some other groups will be still moving to the east, present-day China and Japan. So this map shows you, once again, their place of origin in what today is southern Russia, modern-day Ukraine. This is the homeland of the Indo-Europeans, and how they're beginning to move into Europe, as you can see in those arrows. To the west, they're going to be moving southward here to Asia Minor, or Anatolia, where the present day country of Turkey is located, Anatolia. and yet others are moving into Central Asia, moving into present-day Iran and present-day India. Those are the three regions that the Indo-Europeans will be moving across hundreds and hundreds of years, eventually thousands of years. Very slow and gradual movement. Again, now, rather briefly, here we're just going to explain the regions that the Indo-Europeans are going to be moving, and just looking at some of the cultures that they're going to be creating rather briefly. So, like I said, one of the regions that the Indo-Europeans are going to be moving into is Asia Minor. And that is, again, just south of the original homeland in modern-day Ukraine. They're going to be moving into what is called Asia Minor, where the country of Turkey is located today. And this is happening as early as 2700 BC. They arrived to this region that today is called Anatolia, for example, and they're going to become a society or culture known as the Hittites. And they're going to create a sort of kind of civilization, although they're not really at this time creating a civilization necessarily. In other words, they're not creating large urban areas or cities, but they're going to create a culture, more properly, again, described as a culture known as the Hittites. Okay, and they were known to develop certain technologies, not only made from bronze, but also they started experimenting with iron working as well, iron tools. So that is going to give them an edge, an advantage, as we'll see, over all the other civilizations that were nearby, for example, Egypt and Mesopotamia. They have war chariots, for example, they have the horse, they have bronze tools, they have now iron, and they have a culture of warfare, and they're going to be instrumental in shaping the direction of both Egypt and Mesopotamia. But conversely, they're also going to be absorbing many of the ideas, the civilization, for example, the contributions, the innovations of Egypt and Mesopotamia as well. So they also acquire a sense of civilization through their trade and interaction with the ancient Egyptians and Mesopotamians as well. One of the, for example, changes that they underwent as they interacted with the Egyptians and Mesopotamians is the change in monarchy. Remember, they practice what is called elected monarchy, but now they're going to adopt the way the Egyptians and the Mesopotamians construct their monarchies, which are more divine or oriented. They're going to be transitioned from elected to divine monarchy. In other words, that their monarchs are going to claim divine status, and this is an appropriation from a foreign, of course, culture. So there's going to be, of course, an influence in both directions. Other groups of Indo-Europeans will be moving westward into what is today the continent of Europe proper. Very early on, we see some of those groups moving as early as 4000 BC, and for thousands of years they will continue to move all the way to 1500 BC, and they're going to be known as the Celts. Okay, and they're going to be the very first group that actually populated, inhabited the European continent. They're Indo-Europeans, of course. They're known as the Celts. Really, again, they're a very ancestral group. You can say they're the forerunners, if you will, of Europe. One of the most indigenous or native groups, again, the Celts of Europe. And they populated, of course, a number of regions: Central Europe, modern-day Germany, France, some portions of the Iberian Peninsula, Spain, and others went up north to Ireland and what is called the British Isles. They created, of course, ceremonial centers like Stonehenge, for example, the Celts. They created, of course, centers of worship, particularly to the sun god. They're worshiping the sky, they're worshiping the sun, and they create, of course, ceremonial centers where they carry out ceremonies. And what is very interesting to note is that, for example, when you look at Stonehenge, the pillars that, the way they were organized was to also mark the passing of the sun across the year, particularly the beginning of winter and the beginning of summer, what is called, again, summer and winter solstices. Again, you can see how during the first day of summer, that is June 21st, and the first day of winter, December 21st, the sun sets exactly in the very middle of a marker. They do have a marker, a couple of pillars, and the sun, of course, you can see how it aligns perfectly on the two columns. So, of course, they were astronomers. They were observing the sky. They worshiped the sky. They worshiped the sun, and they created ceremonies. Again, this is in modern day England. Again, it's called Stonehenge. This was done by the Celts, the ancient Celts, one of the forerunners, again, of Europe. There were further migrations into Europe from 2100 BC all the way to 1200. We see the Greeks, the Mycenaeans, and the Italians, of course. They are Indo-Europeans. They're settling here in southern Europe, particularly southeastern Europe. They're going to become the ancient Greeks, and of course the Italians or the Romans again. And yet other groups settle in Central Europe and Eastern Europe as well. The Slavs that became the forerunners of the Russians, for example, they're called the Slavs. The Germans in Central Europe, and yet other group of Germanic tribes move up north to the Scandinavian countries, and they're going to become the Vikings as well. They're all Indo-Europeans, although their languages are very different. Their languages descend directly from Sanskrit. Again, they do have connections going back in time to the linguistic group, in other words, the Sanskrit. Another group, as I mentioned, is going to be moving into Asia. They're going to be moving east from 2100 to 1800 BC. They're known as the Indo-Aryans. Again, they're going to be moving into Persia. They're going to create Persia, modern day Iran. So the people of Iran, again, are Indo-Europeans. This is very different because, again, we tend to kind of confuse, the Middle East as to be a region that is totally different, distinct from, let's say, Europe. But in fact, there are a number of groups like the Iranians in this case that are actually Indo-European, and they're going to be the forerunners of Persia. Later on, they're going to become the country of Iran. Yet some other Indo-Europeans are going to be moving into the Indian subcontinent, and they're going to settle there and transform the culture of India. And we're going to see the rise of a very distinct civilization that was a mixture between Indo-European and the native people of India, something we're going to get to look at in a future topic. Okay, so you can see in this map the different directions that the Indo-Europeans took over the course of thousands of years as they stepped out of their region, as they moved into the West, in Europe, the different groups that they formed, the different cultures, in Anatolia, Asia Minor, the Hittites, and of course the Persians and the Indo-Aryans of India, as well, as you can see in this map. So last but not least, the nomads played a key role in the ancient world. Just to close down this session, they are going to have a profound impact in the ancient world. In what way? Well, number one, they're going to, because they're coming from a very strong cultural background of center on warfare, they're going to foster warlike cultures in different parts of the world. In other words, they're going to exert a cultural influence on the other societies that they encountered, because they're bringing along with them not only certain technologies or certain religious ideas, they're also bringing certain skills, the skills of war. They have a society based around the practice of warfare. They value warfare not only as a way of life but as a necessity. They have an assembly of warriors that elect a warrior king. So they're going to influence, of course, the other civilizations that they encounter, in that the other civilizations and the other societies are going to absorb those features. Those warlike cultures will be appropriated by the other societies. That means that the civilizations that the Indo-Europeans encountered, and in many cases they wage war upon, they're going to transform into empires. We're going to see the rise of imperialism in Mesopotamia and also in Egypt. And as we see the rise of empires, those empires will expand significantly, and they're going to become what is called world empires. A world empire was just a very large, gigantic area where one city was in control of the entire domain, of the entire system, that is to say, encompassing hundreds of different kinds of groups, linguistic groups and cultures governed by a single monarch. This was an outcome of the so-called nomadic or barbarian invasions. As the Indo-Europeans invaded those civilizations became more warlike. And of course, this is going to give rise to universal ideas and institutions. Those empires required developing ideas that were going to be shared and followed by all the multiplicity of groups that they controlled and governed. They needed to develop religious ideas that everybody will follow, religious cults, for example, systems of laws and so on, that everybody will follow. And those are the very first time in world history that we're going to see, again, the formation of universal institutions and ideas. And this was the direct result of the Indo-Europeans moving out into different parts of the world and creating those changes. Okay, so this is the end of the first session. When we come back, we're going to be moving into part 2, the rise, the dawn of empires and universal ideas. Thank you.